Welcome back to Performance Process, everybody. I'm Kaylee Fretz. We got a great show for you today. We got another in a string of shows, actually, all on the same topic with the same fella, Ronan McLaughlin. Who are we talking with today? Who are you talking with today, specifically?
Well, I am not talking with him today. Back at the Tour Down Under, I think it was even before Tour Down Under started. It was like a day or two before the start. I spoke to JP Ballard of Swisside, who listeners to the podcast will have heard me doing a pit walk with recently. That was during the Tour Down Under. We sort of went through the various World Tour setups and critiqued those, getting JP's expert eye to sort of pick out the fast from the not so fast. And this
fun one.
This podcast probably should have come out before that, because we sort of delve into who Swisside are, what they do, a bit of their background. You know, they're obviously a wheel brand. They have some clothing items that they sell also, but they're primarily a consultancy brand for all or a consultancy firm for all their cycling industry manufacturers. And you know, time and time again we hear these. We hear of Swisside mentioned in press releases from other brands. Such and such a product was developed in collaboration with Swisside and leaning on Swisside's aerodynamics and wind tunnel expertise. And so, as such, JP is someone I've wanted to speak to on a podcast for a long time. I think today's episode is the first part in a two-part series. The entire recording is 3 hours long. And we've decided not to publish the 3 hours all in one go. We've decided to split that up a wee bit. So let me know if I was wrong to split it up. If you're listening to this and you wanted the full 3 hours, let me know. But apologies, it's coming out in two parts. And today's part is very much a delve into who Swisside are and what Swisside do. So it's a bit brand heavy, this one, to be honest with you.
Yeah, we were talking about this before we hit record, and you know, addressing the elephant in the room, right? Like, just to be really clear, there's no sponsorship from Swisside in this podcast. It's just the fact that this particular company, like you said, interacts with so many other brands within the cycling space, and even some outside the cycling space, with their expertise, that they're a particularly interesting, well, JP is a particularly interesting guy to talk to, basically. And that's what we seek, is interesting folks to talk to.
And even more specifically than that, realizing that JP was in Adelaide at the same time, I was first of all determined to do a podcast with him, because I'd been trying to track him down for so long. And then secondly, beyond all the work he does for manufacturers in the cycling industry, Swisside sort of first developed themselves in the triathlon space and did a lot of interesting aero interventions, let's say, in the triathlon world. And I sort of wanted to, chat to him about that, get a sort of an insight into his aero expertise, and some of the things we discussed in the podcast are, it's a very, very interesting conversation. We talk a lot about simulation tools, and specifically some of the work that he has done in building a simulation tool to the Ineos Grenadiers spec, what they want from what they call the virtual pit wall. It's not a Swisside product. He couldn't really talk about it, but they do sort of build it for Ineos. They don't know what Ineos does with it after that, but he obviously does have his own simulation tools, and they're not just bringing in the usual things like power and aerodynamics and atmospherics and giving you a predicted time. They're also including things like W prime and depletion rates and team time trial pacing, and accounting for descents and corners and the fastest way to set up a team time trial team, and even right down to incorporating core body temperature, which we've talked so much about in this podcast, into their simulation software, is just a level of that I didn't anticipate that the software was going. We also had like a general discussion on sort of component development and how the balance of performance is something else, but balance of performance in terms of balancing out weight and aerodynamics, and which is more important, and Swisside sort of general aerodynamic philosophy, and they lean a lot on what is called the sail effect, and JP delves into telling us what the sail effect is. And then we sort of talked a lot as well about the sort of the future of aero in cycling. Are we at peak aero at the moment? Spoiler alert, JP reckons we're not even 50% of the way towards peak aero, and we will never be at peak aero. So yeah, it was, I mean, I'm
always more to learn.
Yeah, at this point it's probably best we just jump into it and hear the podcast.
Well, we got 3 hours to get through. Well, 90 minutes today, 90 minutes again. So let's jump into your chat with JP.
Well, Jean-Paul Ballard, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining us. You're from Swisside, a brand that, well, I think listeners will be becoming increasingly aware of this year as you sort of kickstart your partnership with the AG2R Citroën squad. Thank you for joining us in the podcast. We're here today to talk, first of all, to get to know Swisside, and then to sort of, well, answer a few questions I have about some of the work that Swisside do, because we all know you're a wheel brand, or Swisside is a wheel brand. But I believe there's a heck of a lot of other work that Swisside do also that listeners may or may not be aware of. So I guess maybe the best place to kick off is just to sort of give us a bit of background on the brand Swisside, who they are, what you do, sort of your expertise. And yeah, we'll kick it off from there, I think.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Ronan. Really great to be here in sunny Adelaide. Briefly about Swisside. So we're basically, the best way to describe us, we're a spin-off from Formula One. So we're a bunch of former F1 engineers and now obviously a lot more people. And sort of our basic way of working is to bring the technology, development processes, say data-driven mentality from Formula One to cycling. And we did that sort of, back in my F1 days together with the head of aerodynamics at the time. We were all cycling at lunchtime and we were looking at the equipment and we were saying either we don't understand something about this low-speed aerodynamics stuff or the equipment's not very well developed. And then having done some testing, we did a little sneaky wind tunnel test once and we realized actually, no, most of the equipment's crap. And various other things, it sort of opened up that avenue to maybe doing something different. And then, in 2010, I started the business. 2011, we brought our first wheels, and this was then as a side gig to Formula One. And then it kind of grew and grew, and I saw we could probably do something with this. And then, 2014, I was full-time in the business. It's been 10 years, actually. And, what we do. So as you mentioned, some people, particularly in the triathlon world, know us for our wheels. And for the development we do with athletes. In the road cycling sector, we're less known because we really established ourselves in that triathlon sector. However, we've been working behind the scenes also in the world tour in road cycling for quite a long time now. And that comes down to sort of how our business is structured. So we do our products, wheels, nowadays cockpits, textiles. But then the large part of the business, the biggest part of the business is the consulting. So providing engineering support, the strong point in aerodynamics, to industry partners. Our key partners are DT Swiss, big wheel manufacturer, Canyon, Rudy Project, Ekoi, and in most recent couple of years, of course, Decathlon and the new Van Rysel brand. And then the third part of what our business does is athlete and team support. And so previously, of course, working a lot with triathletes. But actually behind the scenes, already since 2015, we've been working with World Tour teams, starting with Team Brain Merida, and then actually over 6 years with Sky and now Ineos. So that's sort of a brief taste of what we do. And again, data-driven approach, bringing engineering, development, technology to the cycling industry.
You're saying all the right things here, Formula One, cycling, aerodynamics, you're a man after my own heart. We're definitely going to get into some of those things you just mentioned, especially some of the work with the teams and that you've mentioned. But I want to go back to just that initial sort of thinking. Obviously, anybody starts a business because you think you can do something better. And we were sort of talking before we hit record on this podcast, and you were sort of describing that how you got into the cycling space, and I asked you if you knew then what you know now, would you have gone down that road? Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I thought Formula One was hard, and I thought, when I go into having my own business, I'll be cycling, every day, in the evening, and maybe even have a day off a week. And the reality has been so far away. And I think if you're really passionate about something, you invest everything into it. And I think survival as a startup, because, I was a very good engineer in the Formula One space, but I had no idea about running a business. And so it was a very steep learning curve in those first few years. it's definitely taken me to new limits of my resilience, and I've had some nice meltdowns along the way. So, but when I stop now and look back and look, particularly today, Criterion on Saturday, Swiss Side Wheels, a project of mine, reaches the world tour for the first time. It certainly puts a smile on your face and makes you realize that it's been worth working towards. But yeah, startup, I think, and as I mentioned to you before the podcast, anyone who's gone down the path of starting a business and figuring it out, and in our case, we started a brand and a business together. It's a steep learning curve, and you make it or you break. And so far, we've made it, and I think the future's looking pretty good. So I'll stick with I would have done it.
Well, here at Escape Collective, we certainly know those challenges of getting something off the ground, being a relatively new entity ourselves. So we can certainly relate to that. And as I said to you off air, also I don't believe the old adage that if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. I think if you love what you do, you'll never take a day off is probably more accurate.
At least your mind will never take a day off. That's for sure.
I'm sort of curious before we delve into the work that you do, coming from the F1 background, and especially F1 in that era, pre 2010 when you initially set off on the Swiss side journey. At that point, it was unlimited resources. We all know Formula One is pinnacle of motorsport. Wind tunnels running 24/7, 365 days of the year, and then you get into the cycling space where at that time, it's probably fair to say there was a hefty skepticism over whether aerodynamics was even relevant in cycling, and then couple that with the fact that obviously minute budgets and minute you're just much more constrained working in the cycling industry than I assume you would have been in Formula One. How does that push you in terms of changing your thinking in terms of being an engineer and really pushing you? I'm thinking it's pushing you to your limits as an engineer in a different way, would that be, and maybe constraining you more, would that be fair to say? Or
well, I would actually say not at all.
Okay.
In terms of the cycling industry was so totally underdeveloped. It was like we used to say when it was like picking apples, all this low-hanging fruit. The topic of marginal gains that sort of came up in sort of the mid-teenies or whatever you want to call it. I was thinking, what's he talking about? There's massive gains to be had here. And so actually for me it was you're absolutely right. So maybe to jump into sort of the budgets in F1 and unlimited resources. So to go back to 2005, I was in the Toyota Formula One team there in the aerodynamics department. We would punch about €1 million worth of parts through the wind tunnel every week.
€1 million worth of parts
per week? We would produce about €1 million worth of parts, of which about 15 to 20% of them would actually see the light of day in the wind tunnel, because it would be all about speed of development. So you'd produce families of parts, you'd test one of each family. Each family might have 10 options, and you'd pick the best one or two families that would work, and the rest would just go into the bin. And it was insane. And in that year, Toyota spent over €1 billion. 2005, they commissioned a second wind tunnel. It was insane. And you were right. At those days, particularly at Toyota, it was just open budget, do what you want. So that was really exciting for me.
Hence why Toyota are no longer in Formula One.
Probably. But what was amazing is, despite all of that budget, they never won the Formula One World Championship. And that shows that it's about how you go about solving the problem, and not just about shooting it with brute force and cannons. So that was also, say, an important learning. And sort of to move a little bit further forwards in my last year in Formula One, so in 2014, I was head of the complete F1 car concept at the Sauber F1 team, but we had really limited budgets because BMW had pulled out a few years earlier. It was a small team at the time. We were punching well above our weight, but the regulations had become highly restricted as well. So in that case, we had restricted regulations, restricted budget. So my ability to develop the car was really small. And you had teams of people that were, working on a tiny portion of the car. So you had specialists on front wing end plates, for examples, right? So ultimately for me, that was, and my job was much more management and political in some ways at that time. So actually the step out of Formula One, which had become highly restricted both from a budget perspective as well as an engineering innovation perspective, into cycling where it was like, oh my gosh, this is a free reign. There's so much we can do here, was actually really fun. And funnily enough, after a few years of doing this, the head of aerodynamics at the Sauber F1 team, who'd been chief aerodynamicist or head of aerodynamics for 19 years, I was always poking him when we go out in our ride saying, hey, Seamus, when are you going to jump across to Swiss side? And he eventually said, okay, let's talk about this. And he's been with us for 6 years now. So, we actually have a lot of fun. And I know you'll come to the question a little bit later, how much development potential is still there? So there's still lots, just like there was in Formula One, and today in Formula One, they're still developing. So, yeah.
I'm going to indulge in one more Formula One question, and that is, with the way that sport has gone from the days that you just mentioned of billion euro budgets to today, where they've highly restricted how much one tunnel time teams can have. There's budget caps. They can no longer do their airfield aero tests where they just drive the car up and down a runway. They're limited in terms of CFD. Everything, I believe, is highly restricted now, and the teams there are having to become so much more efficient in how they work, especially within their aerodynamics departments. And they're probably no longer working with families of parts like you just mentioned. I'm assuming they're having to be much more select with what they develop and what they test. Well, that sort of the way the likes of yourselves have come from Formula One into cycling, and there's a sort of a trickle-down effect of understanding and technology there. Will that efficiency trickle down into cycling also, do you think? Or is cycling sort of ahead of the game, or ahead of Formula One in those terms, and can perhaps it's the opposite in this case, where Formula One can learn from the likes of yourself in cycling? Yeah,
look, I think we're massively more efficient than Formula One. They're still working with 250 million euro budgets, and the real spending is a lot more than that, because a lot of things that are not in the budget caps and marketing and whatever. Whereas top level World Tour teams here are working with 25 to 30 million budget, so factor of 10. And in the cycling industry in general, they're not selling bicycles are expensive, but they're not as expensive as high-end motor vehicles, and the types of budgets aren't there. So the amount of money available for research and development in cycling, and the willingness of the brands to spend that money is a lot more restricted than in automotive industry. So, we have to be very efficient with what we do. So yeah, I think we are actually very efficient, a lot more efficient than in F1.
Formula One, if you're listening, you can come and learn something from cycling. So I suppose let's delve into the work that Swisside does. You've obviously got wheels. You're also now doing time trial cockpits. You've got the calf sleeves. Is that those product categories? How did you land on those three? Are those like the three most? Well, obviously your wheel brand, but what then motivated the expansion into clothing and time trial extensions?
First of all, as a wheel brand, coupled with what we do with athlete support. So we've been working together with athletes for a long time, since day one, because it's a fantastic marketing tool, and I really believe strongly in working with people and really showcasing what you can do as a brand, what your products can do. Our goal in triathlon, Swisside has won, together with our athletes, we've won everything there is to win. Women's World Championship, Men's World Championship, world records. And that's been done with a data-driven approach. And I think that's something we certainly brought to the cycling industry particularly. And triathlon was much more open for that. Triathletes are much more open to new technologies.
Do you think that like the openness in triathlon, and then your sort of acceptance within the triathlon space and being recognized as a triathlon brand to some aspects, do you think that then, not with the brands, but maybe with individual riders in cycling, kind of hampered you in some way? And that's the sort of, again, going back to that initial sort of reluctance for riders to adopt aerodynamics and that, and then maybe also this preconceived idea that some cyclists have that maybe triathlon is I don't want to say a lesser version of the cycling sport, but there's friction sometimes between triathletes and cyclists, or between cyclists and triathletes more accurately. Do you think being perceived as a triathlon brand maybe slowed your sort of transition into the cycling specific space?
It's a really good question. The answer is I don't know. What's for sure is that I'm absolutely aware of this sort of a little bit of a friction between triathletes and cyclists. But what is 100% clear is that cyclists are really slow adopters, whereas triathletes are keen to find the latest advantage to make themselves go faster. And triathlon is every single race is a race. And it's always measured. It's measured on time. It's measured on positions. So it's very easy to quantify improvements. I would say, the reality is that triathlon is a lot less restricted in terms of what you can do with the athletes, with the bikes and so on. So it's a real development ground. It's a real technological development ground. And I know with many of the brands with whom we've worked, and I mean Canyon in particular, most of the development's been on the triathlon products, and then those learnings trickle down to the road products. So the truth of the matter is actually, I would say, regardless of what, say, end consumers or followers of the cycling industry think, the truth is that our work in triathlon has been part of the reason we've gained the value, particularly with the brands and behind the scenes, and gotten us the opportunity to come into the World Tour. And what's really interesting is, working with the riders of Decathlon AG Desert La Mondiale, it's amazing how many of them know what we've done. And, when I talk about a certain triathlete, oh, yeah, and you did this cockpit and this, and I was like, because, cockpits is a large bit of what we're doing now with the team for time trial, so we'll come to that shortly. But in a nutshell, I think it's actually probably helped us more than hindered us. And perhaps to come back to your original question, how we've spread into new products. So again, Formula One approach, it's about the fastest lap time, right? It doesn't matter if it's aerodynamics or power or, handling. So it's about the whole system. Mm-hmm. And so we apply this whole system approach to the problem of cycling. So that means the bike and rider system. And so our job is always to say, okay, how do we make that system faster? And in triathlon, we saw that wheels were extremely important because of the so-called sailing effect and the drag reduction that you can get with that. So it's potency for aerodynamics. But then 70%, 75% of the drag is the rider. So how can we optimize the rider position? How can we condition the airflow upstream? And that were cockpits. So we had this big project with a triathlete called Patrick Lange, 2-time world champion, to be the first to go under 8 hours in the famous Hawaii Ironman World Championship. We established that, if we do a cockpit, we can find the necessary watts that will achieve that. And in that year, the previous year, he went 802 or 801 it was, and in the following year, 752. And that was a cockpit project. And so that was kind of one of the starting points for us to now, and we've been developing cockpits in triathlon for a while. Last year, we've seen Marlon Reusser in the women's field with one of our cockpits. So step by step, we've seen, and there's been some others unbranded out there. So we've been very much involved in this cockpit. So it was kind of a natural progression, and people like, are you going to bring them to the market? And so now we are. And then finally, textiles. Ultimately, again, 70-75% of the drag is the rider. So it's clearly a place as an aerodynamic specialist where we need to be active. And we've been doing textiles development for a long time. Mm. So now, step by step, we've said, okay, let's bring our own products in some relevant areas. We're not sort of coming out as a massive textile brand like Castelli or whatever, but we're going to start step by step to bring some really, really well-developed products that deliver really good performance advantages, and some more coming this year.
You mentioned there something to the effect of some other unbranded cockpits used by cyclists. I'm thinking maybe I might have seen some of your cockpits at the start of the Vuelta last year in Barcelona, but we'll not get into that. I'm trying to segue into some of the work that you do with World Tour teams, and maybe even before that, we should just touch on the work that you do with the cycling manufacturers and brands.
A huge part of what we do, over 50%, is our consulting business. And it's important to say, people who know Swisside see us as an aerodynamics brand, but we're a performance engineering brand. So again, we look at the system and we say what's necessary for the system, and it's not all aerodynamics. It's aerodynamics, it's weight, it's stiffness in a bike frame. All of these things play a role. So we have experts in all of these fields at Swisside. Aerodynamics is a really important point because it's the most potent in the formula of making you go faster. And it's actually quite funny, when you think about some of the reluctance in the cycling industry to embrace aerodynamics. The fact is the laws of physics haven't changed. They've always been the same.
I don't know. They might have changed.
They might have changed. It was in some virtual world. But yeah, so we really look at that. I know we're going to come to it afterwards, but we do a lot of simulation. So we can simulate any course with any rider, taking into account all of the parameters, whether they be the physical parameters, weight, aerodynamics, rolling resistance, physiological parameters, what power can the rider bring, W prime, so kind of their battery storage, if you want to call it like that, environmental, winds, hills, whatever. And
corners,
absolutely. Corners are really important.
Which a lot of models don't account for.
No, absolutely. No, we have corner modeling, we have braking modeling, we have ideal line modeling through the corners. Very, very advanced tool that we've developed in-house over years.
Virtual pit wall, is that what?
Well, so one of the products that's come out of our simulation tool. So the simulation tools that we develop are ours, and then we produce for Ineos. So people may have heard of this thing called the virtual pit wall, which is basically a front end that uses, say, this back end code that we develop. And where, of course, if Ineos says, "Oh, we want something to be able to simulate something in addition," we'll go and write extra code to make that possible. And this virtual pit wall, let's say in the most simple form, is used for a individual time trial. So you've got a rider, call it Filippo Ganna, on a certain course, and it's how should he deploy his power on that day, on that course, with the wind conditions, with the temperature, with everything that's happening, to get to the line the fastest, and to get to the line with nothing left in the tank. And that's actually quite interesting. On a typical, let's say, 40-minute time trial, the difference between an optimized strategy, apparently an optimized power delivered strategy, and an unoptimized one can easily be more than 30 seconds. And that's with no extra effort. That's just using your available power in the right way with regards to the course and the environmental conditions.
That's fascinating. I feel I've sort of taken you off topic from the talk about the consultancy work you do with the brands. So we'll maybe come back to the virtual pit wall stuff, because that is fascinating. But I think it would be interesting to hear about the consultancy work with manufacturing brands. But
it's a great trickle over, because through this performance development work and these simulations that we do, it's really easy to identify on any course. So a brand like Canyon might say, we want to develop a bike that works for this, use case. And, it could be like, rolling hills or whatever. And we can calculate what's the right mix of aerodynamics, weight, stiffness, these sorts of parameters to deliver the fastest bike. And so that's always a starting point for us. And then we move in and we start developing the product. So maybe using Canyon as an example. Canyon's been a fantastic partner of ours over the years. I think the first project we did with them was, back in 2016. Mm-hmm. And since then, together with them, we've provided them with aerodynamic support. But also when we do a bike project, it's aerodynamics, weight, stiffness to weight ratio, all of those things. And all of the current Canyon bikes that are on the market have been developed together with us. So the aero, the Endurace, the Ultimate, which we see here in the World Tour as well, the Speedmax, and most recently the track bike. Mm-hmm. That was probably the biggest project we did, because we also did the wheels, and we actually even manufactured the wheels for that bike for Canyon. Mm-hmm. A lot of work together with those sorts of customers. But then there's also, it's not just bikes. We do development on helmets. So we've done a lot of helmets over the years. So the Van Rysel helmets that the Age Desert team are riding are developed by us. We've done a bunch of helmets for Ekoi, Rudy Project, some work for Canyon. A lot of work on helmets. Textiles, done a lot of textiles development, little projects big projects actually, also for World Tour teams. We really, everywhere where performance and in particular aerodynamics has got a role, we provide consulting services to many brands across the industry.
And dropping you here, folks, not to cut you off like we normally do, we're going to roll out this entire episode to everyone, members and non-members. What you'll get now is the rest of this podcast uninterrupted. But what we are going to ask is that if you like what you hear, and if you want to hear the entirety of future episodes, please head over to escapecollective.com/join and sign up, become a member now, and you will get all of the Performance Process podcasts delivered to your podcast feed in future uninterrupted, because normally we cut them off here and you don't get the second half if you're not a member.
But we're being nice today.
Being nice today.
Every time a member joins, a wind tunnel gets its wings.
I like that. I was going to say every time a member joins, we get one member closer to the 50,000 that we need this week to buy me a Lamborghini. If you don't know what we're talking about, head over to one of our other podcast placeholders this week's where Kaylee has promised me a Lamborghini if 50,000 people sign up this week.
We're not quite there, if I'm honest. Yeah. Okay. Oh, I think we have a ways to go.
Every member helps me. Come on,
helps.
Sign up, people. Get me a Lambo. You mentioned the sort of simulation work that you do for those manufacturers, and then trying to optimize new frames and new bikes and that based on that work. How transferable is that then to, say, myself or Joe Soap buys one of those bikes that you've worked on and takes it down their usual training ride or training route? How much does that transfer? Like, how confident are you that when you optimize for the simulation you're running, that actually for thousands of different people who are going to ride that bike on thousands of different courses, that the gains are useful across all those different scenarios? One
important thing maybe to say here is the bike frame performance is pretty independent from who's sitting on the bike. So if a bike A is 10-15 watts better than bike B, doesn't really matter who's sitting on it, you'll have that performance benefit. In terms of the different types of riders and how they use their bikes, ultimately that's down to the brand. So again, if a brand like Canyon says, okay, we want you to develop the aero. The aero is a bike that's developed with racing in mind, high speed, rolling hills. So it's going to have a much more heavy weighting on aerodynamic performance. And that's up to Canyon to decide. We work to their constraints. Whereas if it's a bike like the Ultimate, which is, driven to be a minimum weight climbing bike, of course, not neglecting aerodynamics, but there's a much more stronger weighting and emphasis on weight, stiffness to weight ratio, agility of the bike frame, how it feels to ride. So again, that's sort of a prescribed mix that Canyon wants us to develop, and we have to develop the bike within the window, the performance window that they want. So it's very much the brands that set the tone and set the performance targets for the bike. And it's also why there's not really ever a conflict when we do a bike for Canyon or Van Rysel or Simplon or whoever it is that we're working with, because every brand brings their own philosophy. Every brand brings their own constraints.
Does that ever get frustrating in that you're sort of banging your head against the wall thinking this brand wants this, but it's not what we think they need?
Absolutely. But ultimately they're our customer. So we have to deliver the customer what they need. And I think it's a good inroad maybe into the topic of weight and lightweight bikes and aero bikes, because in triathlon, aero is so important, and you can pretty much 99% of the time completely forget about weight, because anything that delivers an aero performance improvement is worth having, even if it adds a few grams or even a few 100 grams to the bike. And every race in triathlon is a race. So
is that still the case though, if you're adding every element of the bike is a few 100 grams heavier, and then suddenly all of a sudden your bike is 3 kilos heavier than it could be? Is that
so again, it comes down to the performance simulation. So I can give you some really key hard facts. So on a typical Ironman course, that would be like Ironman Hawaii or Challenge Roth or one of these typical courses, over 180 kilometers, the effective penalty of an additional kilo of weight is around about 25 to 30 seconds for a pro. And if we add aero improvements to a bike, they will typically cost a few 100 grams. And they're normally worth 4 to 5 minutes in comparison. So you're always comparing like 5 minutes with 30 seconds.
Yes.
It's a no-brainer. So it's orders of magnitude difference, really. Hence why in triathlon it's pretty much always aero-driven. But what I wanted to come to is for every triathlete is competing in racing. So 100% of triathletes race. In cycling, I would say 2% of cyclists race.
Yes.
Most cyclists are out there for health and fun and the community and just enjoying riding their bike. And that's something I had to really get my head around, is it's not all about aero for those guys, because what do you feel when you ride a bike? You feel the weight, it feels light, it feels agile. That makes the riding experience perhaps more fun. And that's absolutely legitimate for someone who isn't interested if they're 10 minutes faster on a particular ride, but their goal is to enjoy themselves. Totally fine. So, but if you're a racer and your goal is, KOMs or Strava segments or winning races, then you have to be focused on aerodynamics. So, there's a broad, particularly in the road cycling sector, there's a broad range of customers that want different things from their bikes. And our goal with the brands is to develop for those customers what suits their needs.
If I think of the work that I know of, Swiss Side have been involved with different brands, and Canyon is the obvious one. For the past 3 or 4 years, it seems to be almost every new aerodynamic product coming out seems to have been linked to Swiss Side in some way or another. Swiss Side has been mentioned in the press release of countless press releases that come across my desk. And then I look at your own products and especially the wheel sets. If we were to boil down your sort of, if we go back to Formula 1 terms for a second, but your aero philosophy or your aero concept into one key category, do you think it would be fair to say the sail effect is something that you've sort of focused on the most and tried to adopt the most, and it's not something we hear about from many other brands?
Yeah, look, sailing effect, it's so important. So maybe for people who don't know what I'm talking about, as soon as you get a tiny little bit of crosswind, all right, and we're talking about, the wind is coming at you not straight head on, which basically never happens. It's coming from you at 5 degrees from the front. So, it's definitely a headwind, but it's coming slightly to the side. On a windy day, if you're riding 30 kilometers an hour, you might be coming at 15 to 20 degrees from the side. So this is this effective onset flow angle, we call this. Now, when that happens, you get a sailing effect. So to boil it down really simply, you have a sailing boat. Everyone knows a sailing boat. It has a sail and it goes forwards, right? It doesn't have a motor, but it's going forwards. So what that means is it's producing more thrust than it is drag, that sailing effect. And on a bike, it's no different to a sailing boat. It's just on the ground. So we have sails, and the main sails are the wheels. The frame itself develops some sailing effect as well. And then you have a keel, which is basically your connection to the ground, which stops you sliding sideways. And through that effect, you can generate a forward thrust when you get slight crosswind. And just like a sailing boat goes upwind, so can a bicycle. And it's really interesting to put into context a good aero road bike with a 15-degree onset flow angle with a good set of wheels can develop well over 35 watts of forward thrust. So it doesn't mean that it goes by itself because you've got this big blob called a rider sitting on top of it, which is very draggy. But
if you could make it stand upright on its own, would it go forward into a headwind?
It wouldn't.
Okay.
Because the drag reduces to, it still remains positive drag, but it reduces down to sort of 10, 15 watts from a base drag of around 80. Or no, it depends. So I'm talking about, when I'm giving you numbers here, I'm talking about weighted numbers. So it's like we consider the full crosswind range. But typically speaking, as I said, a good aero road frame can develop 35, 40 watts of drag reduction. So it reduces its drag by that amount, which means you have to pedal that much less.
Yeah.
And that's huge. And so to develop fast aero bikes, it's not just about reducing the frontal area and making them as slippery as possible in the wind when the wind comes from the front. And that's characterized by track bikes because on the velodrome you see no crosswind. So you end up with, really kind of pointy trailing edge profiles, but they don't tend to work so well in crosswind. So we've seen this progression over the years of what people call camtail profiles. So they're profiles that are kind of cut off at the back. They mean you've got a much longer profile effectively. It's just then shortened because you've got, an 80 millimeter UCI rule for typical tubes.
It's like witchcraft.
It's like witchcraft. Yeah, exactly. And so, with these little tricks, we can develop these bikes that work really well in crosswind. And that's been one of the biggest areas where there's been improvements over the years in road cycling and now in the peloton. And that's why they're just a hell of a lot faster because you're just saving energy all the way along and saving watts.
This sail effect, is that something that's evident in all deep section rims and aero profiled frames, or can it be optimized, more or less?
Oh, optimized more or less for sure.
Are you getting like a base effect? If you stick on a set of 60mm rims, regardless of the rim, are you likely to get some benefit, or is it like aerodynamics in general where you could go badly wrong without realizing?
No, you can absolutely go badly wrong. So it's all about the shape. So, it's like saying I have an aeroplane, I just put 2 flat plates on and I'll fly. You won't even get off the ground. So the shape of the wings, in our case, the shape of the rims or the shape of the tube profiles are highly sensitive to whether or not they work. And actually a shitty profile, let's take, I won't mention any brands, but old school V-shaped rims. We went through a phase where people were building just purely V-shaped rims. They may have had a 40, 50 millimeter deep section, structurally massively efficient, super lightweight, really stiff, aerodynamically terrible. So although they had a certain profile depth, they were extremely inefficient as aerodynamic profiles. So
a lot of the early deep carbon rims were that sort of shape as well, weren't they? Like, you think back to the 90s and 2000s, it was almost like a tick box. You get a 50mm rim, you've got an aero game, but what you're saying is you might not have.
Yeah, you wouldn't have,
Okay.
definitely. Furthermore, you probably had quite an unstable wheel in the wind. And particularly for the front wheel, the stability in the wind is extremely important because, I mean, everyone I think has experienced riding down at high speed down a mountain pass, and you get these sort of wind gusts, and all of a sudden you get this jung jung, this sort of real what do I call it, sort of shudder in the front wheel, which can even throw you off the bike in the worst case scenario, or put you on the wrong side of the road.
Mm-hmm.
Those sort of stability characteristics, how a wheel reacts in wind gusts, how it reacts in crosswind, is extremely important, and that's actually where we do a lot of work. What's the pressure, the air pressure distribution on these wheels to make them stable, to make them easy to ride, so that you can benefit from the sailing effect the most. So we want the biggest sails possible, are the easiest to ride, which means you're the fastest you can be.
Do you think is that still an area of untapped potential in cycling? Is that like the next frontier, or is that already have brands already sort of understood the sail effect and adopted it widely?
I think a lot of the brands have understood that.
Okay.
I mean, all the top brands are doing wind tunnel testing now, so they can't not have seen this effect.
Is it the same, like you think about the laminar flow in a wind tunnel and you're trying to replicate the sail effect from turbulent flow outdoors? Is that something you can simulate well in a wind tunnel, or is that something that actually might improve as we move more and more of our testing outdoors?
Really deep question and a very interesting one, and you're absolutely right. So most wind tunnels, for people out there, have you design a wind tunnel, have the cleanest, most laminar flow with as little turbulence as possible. So typically, good wind tunnel has less than 0.2% turbulence. Out in the real world, you have orders of magnitude more turbulence than that. Does that influence the performance of the bike? The answer is yes, it does. Testing in the right way, testing with the right levels of turbulence is actually very important. And I think there's very, very few people that understand that, and very, very few people that are doing that. But, at Swisside, we've got a whole lot of onboard measurement sensors that we've had along.
You have an aero meter, for lack of a better term.
Yes, we've had one. And it's funny, that's an interesting topic because it's become something that a lot of people are trying to sell.
I'd kind of forgotten about that just until you mentioned it.
Yeah. So it's a funny one. So there's many brands out there trying to sell devices at the moment. I have to say it's an extremely, extremely difficult problem to solve, and it's really hard to sell a device to end consumers and explain to them how to use it in a useful way. So it's actually a really difficult topic. We've had a device for a long time, not with the intent to sell it. It was always just part of our R&D process. And we used it a lot for outdoor aero testing. I mean, Ineos Sky, even Team Sky was using it back in the days, and Ineos uses it regularly, and a lot of our teams. And
fairly sure I've seen it pop up in the video about Ghana's our record.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it was certainly used there. So Ineos has some of the devices, and they use it on their own, so we're not directly necessarily involved. But coming back to the original point, one of the sensors we have on that allows us to calculate the turbulence in the real world. So the more testing we do, the more information we get about real world turbulence, and we always feed that back into our development process, whether it be CFD, wind tunnel testing, outdoor testing, because ultimately, like in Formula One, the only thing that counts is lap time. So basically in cycling, the only thing that counts is measurable performance on the road, and we have to make sure that our development processes, again, whether that be in the computer, CFD, in the wind tunnel, that all of the performance gains that we see in each of those development processes delivers real performance out in the road. Otherwise, it's just marketing, and we're not about that. We're about performance.
Is that the next frontier then? Is real world? Is that, sounds like you're already there. Is that where the industry's going?
Yeah, I mean, it's clear the industry wants to go there. I know Garmin has bought various brands or various companies to try and develop their own device, yet one hasn't come to the market yet. Again, I can say the reason for that is it's extremely complex to do real high quality, repeatable real world measurements. You need to be aerodynamic experts, you need to be electronics experts, you need to be data processing experts to be able to bring that. And so I think that's been...
My experience is that you need more than 24 hours in one day. which is difficult to get.
It's difficult to get. And then you need the user to use it in the right way. It's difficult, but I think that is a frontier, and I think it will come. I mean, I'm certain it will come. And, but at the same time, I don't think it's a big game changer, because if your setup is faster, you can measure it.
Okay.
And you can measure it with with your power meter. You can measure it with speed. And so, I always say, there's a lot of marketing out there. And I say it for our products. If you buy one of our products, if you buy a product from whichever brand it is, if it's faster, you will be able to measure it. So that means you go out and you pick a certain bit of road, you ride up and back a few times, say hold a fixed power level, let's call it 250 watts, have a look at your speed. Okay, great. Go change whatever it is. You might be testing a new suit. Go and do it again. If it's faster, it's going to be, you'll either have a high average speed, or you'll need less watts to have the same speed. In the end, that's the only thing that counts. So, people talk about, aero testing, and it's really difficult, and it is, if you want really absolute numbers. But for anyone out there, if you buy a new piece of kit, go out and do a structured test, do a back-to-back, same day, same conditions. If it's faster, you can measure it.
I think quite often if we've gone and bought a new piece of kit, we kind of don't really want to know. At that point, you're committed. I myself have the luxury of, having access to more kit, and so, testing things and for me, testing and getting results that I can be confident in standing over and publishing is a really important aspect of why I wouldn't repeat a test like you've just described, which, let's face it, probably is sufficient in most cases. But I think we've kind of strayed into our discussion that we had coming up in terms of current state of aero a bit. Sort of delving into that topic, I want to go back to your virtual pit wall, and again the idea of the next frontier, because it's a good decade or so now that World Tour teams have progressively been paying more and more attention to the smaller and smaller details. Kind of got a sense a couple of years ago that maybe we had reached peak aero, or we had reached peak optimization, or whatever it might be, but still World Tour racing is getting faster. Still the teams are finding improvements. Obviously not every team is using your virtual pit wall. For the teams you are working with, how much gains are you finding for the teams like that, and especially around time trials and that, where previously they thought maybe they had already gone down every avenue?
Look, there's massive gains still to be had. So we're very far from any kind of maxed out optimum, and I think we never will be. It's like everything in the world. There's new technologies that come out that give you new insights that allows you to develop further. You look at motor vehicles on the street. A car from 10 years ago looks and feels and drives very differently to a car today. And that will continue, and it's no different in the world of cycling. Coming back to sort of this topic of the virtual pit wall, just to be clear to listeners, there are other things. Best Bike Split is a say simulation platform out there. It's really good. Does what you need to do in a much more basic way than what the virtual pit wall does. And I think most teams are using a platform like that. But I think one of the big areas of progression which we'll see in the World Tour in the coming years is the adoption of what makes you go faster and applying that to the riders. So aerodynamics is one topic, pacing strategies, not just in time trials, but particularly also in stage races, can also be a topic.
More so than has, listeners might be thinking, they've already been looking at aerodynamics and pacing. You think there's going to be like a step change of some sort in that?
Absolutely. So I think, to understand that, I've got to say, we've moved in, with the Decathlon Age Desert team, and what's been really exciting there is the willingness to be open to adopt this. And this is also very much being driven by Decathlon Group.
Which, I mean, not to be too blunt about it, but a traditional European team maybe didn't always have that willingness to adopt such technologies in that. Absolutely.
And particularly traditional French teams are very much like that. And let's just quickly stop and have a look at why. The reason's human. So most of the technical staff, the directors sportifs in World Tour teams are ex-cyclists, right? They're guys who are racing in the 90s, sometimes early 2000s. And then they've converted to become DSs. And back when they were racing, no one knew anything about aerodynamics, and it was all weight. It was all perceived weight is everything. It's all about weight. It's all about stiffness.
And strategy also, tactics and that, which was where those DSs brought their, that was the expertise they had.
Exactly. And and it was tactics based on gut feeling, based on experience, not necessarily based on a data-driven approach. And so you've got most of these DSs that are driving decisions within teams. But let's say to make this next step, they have to understand, aerodynamics is important, and they have to embrace that. Now, that's really difficult because, like, for any human, you have to realize, the way I did it in the past was not optimum, was not the best, and we did things wrong. And that's not a criticism. There was not the know-how back then. The second step is the current DSs don't have the ability and the experience to do aerodynamics, so you need experts. So you need experts to come in from the outside, and in our case, with Swisside, we bring that expertise to the team. And it's not just pure aerodynamics focus, it's this complete system approach, because it's not always about aerodynamics. There are indeed stages where weight is more important, and we'll jump into that maybe a bit later. So the reason why I expect a big progression over the next few years in all the World Tour teams is as the DSs move and the technical staff within the teams move to embrace, really genuinely embrace, not just sort of give lip service, but really say, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do it properly. You'll see a big step in performance. And we've seen it in the past. You had Sky was one of the early adopters of applying science to cycling, had a huge amount of success. Jumbo-Visma the last few years, bang, doing the same thing, huge amount of success. And it's clear now for all the teams that if you want to have success, you have to work in a scientific, data-driven way. And I'd say we're at 10% at the current
10%
of potential. So I think we're going to see a huge change. To bring back to Formula One, because we like to do this, where World Tour cycling is right now is where Formula One was in the early 2000s. Now, in the early 2000s, you had race engineers. The driver would come in, the driver would say, the car's doing this, it's doing that, it's oversteering in turn one. And the race engineer with his experience would go, okay, we're going to soften the rear, we're going to lift the front ride height a little bit, whatever, to adjust the car dynamic. Nowadays, in today's Formula One, the driver comes in and says something. What then happens is they write that down. The data engineers then look at the data and go, actually what's happening is this. The data is saying actually it's not a rear ride height, or it's not a front ride height problem or a rear stiffness problem. It's whatever. We need a little bit more front aero balance or whatever, or we need to shift something, and they make data-driven changes. And sure, you consider what the driver is saying, but it's data-driven. And nowadays, I'd say the driver comments in Formula One are worth a lot less compared to what the data says. And it's the same thing in cycling. I think what we're going to see is this move to a data-driven approach, and this is certainly what we see Ineos with their virtual pit wall approach. Is it's all about collecting data, understanding data, and then making decisions based on that data, and that will make you faster. And I think that's a massively untapped frontier that we're starting to see, particularly Ineos, Visma, they're a big step ahead. Others, again, why there's no conflict with the work we're doing with Decathlon Agile, because I think it's a team that needs to start with the fundamentals before they can get anywhere near that type of complexity. But there will be big changes over the next year in the World Tour, I see. And that's exactly what we did in triathlon. We brought this data-driven approach. And as I mentioned before, when we started in triathlon, to use the Hawaiian Ironman race times were around about 8 hours 15, and the most recent result was 7 hours 40. So there's been a 35-minute shift in a race time, and that's been driven by aerodynamics and ergonomics to a certain degree as well, mainly around the cycling leg. So that type of learning that we did,
probably nutrition a bit as well.
Nutrition certainly, and training techniques and data-driven training. So don't get me wrong, there's many aspects, but there's been a big shift, and it's been driven by looking at the data. And data's not everything, because riders are still human. And you have a certain better form on one day, less form on another day. But you can also try and understand that through data. But yeah, I think there's a huge frontier to be learned in that respect.
So what kind of data are the likes of anyone else getting from the virtual pit wall? And touched on it a bit earlier. What can you tell us?
I mean, the virtual pit wall is more a front end for analyzing the data and then running simulations and sort of understanding the data. But
I guess I ask that question because the most recent example I'm aware of them really leaning on that tool, and perhaps they're doing it for every race, I don't know, but the most recent example I'm aware of is the Team Times Vuelta started the Vuelta in Barcelona, and one of the challenges there was racing through the city centre and all the, you're not just dealing with the weather conditions and the the wind conditions, but then also how wind interacts with buildings and streets and everything else going on, and the technical nature of that course. And what sort of blew my mind was that actually, as you mentioned, braking zones were built into the simulation. Yes.
Yeah.
And that's not something, and cornering techniques, and that's not something I had thought that simulations for cycling could have done.
I mean, the answer is the more realistic you can make your simulation model, the better the results will give you.
100% makes sense. Yeah.
So it's just a tool. Like, again, it's really important to stress, whether it be a simulation tool like this, whether it be the wind tunnel, whether it be the CFD, all of these are tools. They're simulation tools of one form or another. Wind tunnel is just simulating a certain environment, but it's always a step away from the real world. So basically, the more data you can put into a tool, the closer you can come to rebuilding reality, the more accurate your results will be. And you mentioned cornering and so on. One thing that is becoming a real big topic, which is of extreme importance, is heat management. Mm-hmm. So we've seen the brand Core bring these core body temperature measurement sensors, and it's amazing how important that is to your performance. So, for example, we've seen that when you get above a certain core body temperature, you can straight away, and it's a step change. You get 0.1 of a degree over a threshold, bang, you can lose 20, 25, 30% of your power output from 1 second to the next. And so counterintuitively, if you're using core body temperature as part of your simulation, and in this case, potentially in a live sense, if you see the rider reaching their temperature threshold, you actually have to get the rider to back off so as not to blow up. And it's really hard to do because you think, oh gosh, I can be doing 450 watts right now, and actually I've got to back off to 400.
Sort of like that Formula One message, we need you to look after the tires.
Absolutely. Or we need you to save fuel. Yeah. Because if you don't, you're not going to get to the finish. Yeah. Or you're not going to get to the finish as fast. Mm-hmm. So all of these...
So the core data then is something that you're also including in the simulation?
Absolutely. Wow. Yeah. So these are things that have been... And of course, riders as well can see their core body temperature now live on their headsets if they want to. So all of these aspects, all of these learnings that are coming in, that we realize, this is not a marginal gain. This is, if I exceed my core temperature, I'm going to lose 25% of my power. I can't do that. Mm-hmm. So how do we manage the core temperature? And you see more and more, for example, before time trials now and before races, everyone's wearing a cold vest.
I'm actually working on an article on that as we speak.
So, let's get the core body temperature down before the effort to maximize our window of performance so that we can really push up to that limit and blow up, hit that threshold as you cross the line. Brilliant. Yeah. And the ultimate is you cross the line, you've hit your core temperature threshold if it's a hot day. You've depleted your W prime to zero, which is your kind of your battery, your available power. Mm-hmm. Then you've done the best that you possibly can. Of course, if it's been done in a strategic way. And just to finally come back about team time trial, why that's so important is the level of complexity goes up so much further because you have, a number of riders, each of whom have their own physiology, each of whom has their own W prime depletion rate, each of whom has their own FTP, their own power that they can do, each of whom has their own aero drag, their own CDA, and each of whom has their own weight. And then
each of whom directly impacts the rider behind them.
Each of whom directly impacts the rider behind them. And then you add all of those factors together, and if with something like the virtual pit wall, you can literally simulate what power should each rider do for how many seconds on the front before they need to peel off and drop to the back. And so typically in a simulation for an optimization for a team time trial, this all runs on a supercomputer. We're crunching over 100.
I bet it does.
Yeah, there's over 100,000 iteration loops that happen to find the optimum for those X number of riders on that thing, and then bring into other things into account. You're going to drop two riders.
Are you actually will it give them a simulation of when to drop those two riders?
It will give the simulation of when to drop those two riders. Wow. But again, to come back to it, it's a tool, right? So it will give them the theoretical best, but on the day, things might be slightly different.
Those pesky humans.
Pesky humans. What happens if you get a flat tire?
Yeah.
Or
Lawrence de Plus has a crash which happened in that team time trial.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So,
Not him specifically, but that was what happened in that time trial.
In that time trial, yeah. And so what the teams do a lot now, or I know Ineos do, is they also use it as a tool to simulate the what if cases. So what if our GC rider has a flat tire? Do we let the guys go? Or let's say not the GC, let's say one of the key riders for driving the train gets a flat.
Mm-hmm.
Do we stop and wait for him? Do we let them ride at 50% power? Do we let them ride at a fixed speed, continuous, drop 2 riders back, pick him up, the 30 seconds lost or whatever, catch back up? What's the best way to deal with that what if strategy? So the team doesn't have to try and think in these cases. It's like, shit, this has happened, right? We're doing this, okay, go. And they know in advance that's the best thing to do. And again, this kind of application of simulation, data-driven decision-making with a lot of preparation in advance is going to bring the level of performance overall up to another level. And I think there's a lot still available, which is why I say I think we're at 10% of the potential. And I think over the next 10 years, we'll be making big steps.
I think that's as exciting as it might be, I think it's a scary number that we're at 10%. That's I thought maybe we might have been at 90%.
Maybe I'm being pessimistic with my 10%, but I think we're well below 50% of the available potential. Again, when I see, we've been involved with various teams, from Team Bahrain Merida in the early days, and we've obviously watched and learnt from how Ineos works, and of course then moving in with the work we're doing with Ager Desert, who work very differently. It's amazing. So I think there's and I got no idea how the other teams are working. Yeah. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how each team finds their way in this data-driven world to extract the maximum potential for their individual teams. And of course, it comes down to what riders you've got as well. And then choosing riders based on maybe not just their performance, their palmares, but maybe based on what they can actually do. So, I can't remember there was a great example in American baseball, but, picking a team based on
Moneyball.
Picking a team based on stats. Yeah, maybe in the future, these guys are doing tests and picking teams based on, right, you don't need 3 GC riders in the team. You need a guy who's a good driver of a train for a sprint or for a TT. You need a lightweight climber to support your GC rider. GC rider's got to be an all-rounder. What's the best combination? I mean, the combinations are endless. So
you mentioned earlier Best Bike Split, which is obviously very, very accessible for the likes of myself, and I've used it for years. There was another one previously, Cycling Power Lab. I don't think that exists anymore. And then there may be another one that I'm forgetting right now, but there's a few simulation options out there. Is this virtual pit wall something that might be available to public in future, or is that too advanced?
Yeah, I mean, the virtual pit wall is an Ineos specific front end that's designed purely to meet their needs. But the simulation code in the background is something that we have at Swisside, and I think we are interested in the future in bringing more end consumer user friendly things. It's going to be miles away from what the virtual pit wall is, because that's solving problems that are irrelevant for the end consumer. But it's 6 or I think 5 years old now in terms of its sort of level of iteration. So it's a highly evolved tool, and it's purely exclusive to Ineos. But for sure, the learnings and we use simulation is part of our daily business. So we're doing it to solve any problem. So whether it be designing a bike frame for Van Rysel or Canyon to find the best mix of parameters for that specific use case for our triathletes. There's so many ways we can use this tool. But yeah, I think we're certainly interested in bringing something to the future for the end consumer market. So yeah, keep an eye out.
Interesting. Well, look forward to that. I have one last note that I've written down here to ask you on the virtual pit wall, and its uses are obvious in terms of time trialing and team time trialing. I got the sense there that you were sort of suggesting that it's also used for mass start stage races and road races and just normal stages. Is that right?
Ultimately, what Ineos is using it for is a question for Ineos.
The note that I have here is Mike Tyson. And the reason I've written down Mike Tyson is because he had the famous quote, "Everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face." And I'm wondering if they're using simulations like that for mass start stages and individual one-day races, how applicable is it when every other team has a plan of their own, and the second you start the race, you cannot account for every possible scenario with 200 riders?
Absolutely. I mean, that is, when we started talking about simulation in general, virtual pit wall for Ineos, we talked about the most simple solution, the most simple application is a individual time trial. Then you up the complexity, team time trial. Then you come into a stage race. You've got an uphill finish of a stage.
Mm-hmm.
In the end, effectively, in most cases, the peloton comes to the bottom of that final uphill climb together, and then it's effectively an uphill time trial. And in some cases, it's an uphill team time trial. And I think, again, not knowing, because, the virtual pit wall is a tool that we've developed for Ineos. They use it independently. We don't see what they're using it for, because they're just crunching. We just see the amount of data that they're crunching on our cloud. But we do see, for example, last year in the Tour, you saw Geraint Thomas, regardless of what the other guys were doing, was just climbing at his pace. And the other guys would yo-yo to and from. Again, without knowing what the strategy was, because I don't, my interpretation of that was they calculated his fastest way to the top using his power available, using his W prime available on that particular course. And that's the fastest way to the top. Any battles with other guys just makes him slower. So I thought that was really interesting, because you watched him just doing his thing on that climb, and the battles were happening around him, and he would catch them again, and that would happen around him. And in the end, he'd get to the top, and that was his fastest way. So in terms of how they can apply that kind of technology in a stage race, that's, I think, particular examples. That's a good example. Again, like you say, coming into the infinite possibilities of what could happen in a stage race, absolutely impossible to use a tool like this. But I know one of their original plans, and it was mentioned in a podcast or a video that they did years ago. The reason it's called the virtual pit wall is they want to have data on the pit wall to see what's happening during the race,
mm-hmm.
and to be able to make better decisions during the race based on data. I believe that's the direction they want to go. Again, what we're doing for them is providing them the tools, developing them front end that allows them to do the types of potentially live simulations they want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's going to become I think it's a really useful tool that they're using that helps them perform at their best potential.
It's also kind of a scary thought. If the entire peloton raced the way Geraint Thomas raced that particular climb, it might get a little bit boring, I might suggest. But despite saying that, I'm going to say, unfortunately, at the moment, the UCI doesn't allow any sort of telemetry to come back from the bike during a stage or during a race. Firstly, is that what your aerometer is doing? Is providing data into the model? Is that when any of us are running simulations, are they mounting your aerometer going out doing a recon, and that'll feed the model for that day? And then secondly, where could we go if telemetry was permitted?
I think if telemetry was permitted, there's a huge.
Would we straight away have every World Tour bike with an aerometer on it?
Oh, I think so. It'd be about, and we do have a certain level of telemetry now with Valon. These data goes up to the cloud. It's available to the team. What's published. So I think there is sort of a certain amount of telemetry that's happening now indirectly. I don't actually know how good or how live and how accurate that information is, but it's coming. I think it will come.
Well, there's presumably an entertainment value in that.
Oh.
For if you're getting all the data from riders and live in a consumable way, surely that would add the entertainment factor, or at least the interest factor of watching a bike race live. But the other question was just in terms of how much a recon ride with your aerometer can feed the model.
Our aerometer is more of a upfront development tool. So,
okay.
Ultimately for these tools, one of the most important parameters is what's the CDA, the aero drag coefficient for each rider.
Mm-hmm.
So you need that information. So whether you put them in a wind tunnel and get that, whether you do that with on-road testing, or whether you use the CDA meter to compare what you measure in the wind tunnel to out on the road, that's one of the key parameters you need to put in. So I think once they have the CDA of the rider, they don't really need to recon with our device. So I don't see it as a key part of the direct stage by stage preparation. However, just to jump back to to that example with G, on the climb. I think one of the things is, he's a rider who's in the later end of his career. He knows he probably can't compete with a Vingegaard or whatever. He's just got to do his thing.
Yeah.
Whereas I think the younger riders, there's a lot more unknowns with them. I think also for themselves, where are their limits? What can they do? There's the mental aspect. Everyone knows you'll know as a professional, semi-professional athlete nowadays. But from your experience, if you have a good day, you can lift, you can do more, right? So I don't think it'll ever get boring, because I think
I mean, you could add all of that in the world and it wouldn't get boring for me, but some people may consider that boring.
Yeah, but I think you won't end up with processions of riders doing their own thing up a climb, because I think there will always be that element of psychological pressure breaking everybody. It's the same as tennis. I pick the same. All of these guys are equally good in tennis. It's a mental game. So and it's still exciting, because it's how do they deal with that pressure. And I think in World Tour cycling, it's going to be the same. So the data helps you lift the level overall. But I think at the end of the day, that psychological aspect, that battle will always still be a key part of a bike race.
Delving a little into the future of aero then, or more so into the future of aero, you mentioned we're at somewhere between 10 and 50% of the potential at the moment. Where does the future lie? Is it, as we move to more and more to outdoor testing, that actually, where previously we've just thought, well, deeper the wheel, for an example, the deeper the wheel, the faster it'll be, where actually we might start to think, well, in today's conditions, actually this shallower wheel might be a faster setup than this larger wheel today, or in this environment, or whatever it might be. Is that sort of are we now in an era where we have to look at the even less obvious places for gain, rather than, I think where we were until now was the low-hanging fruit, as you described it earlier?
So first of all, just to mention the 10%, let's say, correct it to sort of less than 50%.
Yeah.
I don't mean specifically with regards to aerodynamics. I mean with regards to overall performance potential.
Okay.
That teams can extract with their way of working, with the technology that they have at hand, where we can go. So I think there's a lot in overall potential. In aerodynamics, I think teams are a little bit further. I think the bike brands are a little bit further than that. But yeah, look, I think particularly with aero wheels, your example just before. Is deeper always better? The answer is no. Perfect example. So I was actually out yesterday reconning the Willunga Hill ride. I drove actually. I'll admit, I drove the whole course, and I was looking at the wind conditions, and there are some really exposed sections there. And we've seen in the past on some of these stages, you can get some big echelons forming, and echelons are forming because there's a really strong side wind. And in order to be able to handle the side wind, some of the lightweight riders might not be able to ride the deepest possible rims. Now, of course, with Swissride products, we design our products to be so that they can ride the deeper section rims in the highest possible strength wind conditions. But there's a limit to everything. And if you've got Parapente, one of the riders with us, who weighs 50 kilos, at some stage he's going to have to step down because he doesn't want to get blown off the road. And then again, the Willunga Hill stage is a great example because it ends with an uphill climb. Now, admittedly, it's only sort of 7.7% or something on average, but nonetheless, it's an uphill climb at the end. So that's going to be strategic for who gets to the top. So their weight starts to become more important. It's actually, for a pro rider, right on the threshold where you would select something lighter over something more aero. So for example, for that stage, I think with Age Desert, at least, we'll see them riding the 50mm wheels, which are our 500s, instead of the 625s, which are 62mm deep, just to deal with potential crosswinds. Again, I'll be watching what the weather forecast is for that day and advising the team respectively, but also considering that final uphill time trial, which it effectively is, that final uphill section, to have that small weight penalty. And then the tyre selection is also interesting in that sense because there's a trend to go towards 28mm tyres. However, 25mm tyres are both more aerodynamic on the front at least, and also lighter. So there are certain aspects where you would choose a 25mm tyre, also from a weight perspective.
One other thing we've sort of heard mentioned a few times in the last few years is this notion of sort of flow control, where you're sort of inducing a bit of drag somewhere on the bike, and with the idea that you're going to reduce the overall drag when you factor in the rider. Is that something that can work at the speeds that we see in cycling?
It's definitely something that can work at the speeds we see it cycling, but there are a lot of brands talking about this and doing things, but it's really, really dangerous. Okay. Not dangerous from a safety perspective, dangerous from an aero perspective. So this is where you've really got to be in the wind tunnel, and you've got to consider crosswind. So the yaw angle, the onset flow angle. When we've done a lot of development this direction for time trial and triathlon, and if you create a loss upstream, so you deliberately create some turbulent, messy air that hits the rider with the idea of reducing the drag on the rider. That's basically what we're talking about here. You've got to make sure that block of turbulent air hits the rider in the right spot. Now, with constantly changing wind conditions, you might be completely missing the rider or not hitting them in the right spot, which means you end up with a net drag increase. And we've done a lot of testing of various stuff that we've seen because we're in the wind tunnel all the time. And so we just go and 3D print some parts, test, see what these other guys are coming up with, and we're yet to find a single drag, a drag producing device which leads to a net gain in the overall range of wind conditions that we see. So we see that as, we're very skeptical about that. Where it potentially can work is on the velodrome, and of course we saw the Lotus Hope bike, which has the very wide front fork. The idea is to dump some of the drag of the fork onto the legs of the rider to help reduce the drag on the rider. And then they do the same with the chain stays, with the seat stays at the back, wide seat stays that sit in the wake of the legs. Really interesting concept. When I saw that, I thought, oh, that's really cool. But then, when you look, a good fork has 1 watt drag at 45 kilometers an hour. The potential is 1 watt. So,
is it not more though, because it's the drag on the rider's leg that they're solving for rather than the drag on the fork?
Yeah. So the idea is a little bit of both. If you've got a really minimal, drag front fork, the wake it produces is really tiny.
Yes. Okay.
And the impact it has on the leg is going to be really, really, really small. And the leg's actually really, really interesting. It's a really dynamic system because it's going up and down, and you've got vertical flow vectors and all sorts of stuff going on. So without going down that rabbit hole, we investigated that. So, everyone who's looked at the new Canyon track bike, of course, when we started developing that bike with Canyon, we looked at all options. And you'll notice that we ended up with an ultra narrow fork. Yeah. It's got a 40 millimeter wide hub. The fork is almost touching the rim, within the tolerances allowed or required by the UCI. And at least based on our research, that was the fastest solution.
The Hope take on it then, are they having to create a fork that has much more than 1 watt of drag at those speeds? Is that the concept there, or is their fork still ultra slippy? And maybe maybe there are other takes on that concept as well. So it's not even just Hope that we're talking about. There's the Japanese track bike, and there's others as well. So maybe not single out Hope. Absolutely, I just used that as one example. Yeah.
The Hope bike I think actually has quite a slippery front end. So I actually don't think they're producing drag deliberately, but they're combining two things. The only downside of that is they add a lot of surface area by making that fork so big and wide, and then there's a stiffness consideration or installation stiffness consideration, particularly with the front wheel. I think it's great. Like I love it. We're doing our research, we're doing our development based on our knowledge, and it's really great to see competition from others coming up with other ideas, and we're all challenging each other. So I don't want to say at all that our solutions are the best. We're doing the best we can based on our understanding, but other people will have other approaches and maybe find something else. So just to come back and to your question, whether these deliberate drag producing devices can help with the bike rider interaction, I do think that's one of the areas that there's a lot more potential is integrated systems. So how the bike interacts with the rider. Are there things that can work well there? But I personally am fairly skeptical at the moment, just because I'm yet to find a design myself and even measure a competitor's design that actually delivers a genuine benefit compared to the solutions we're coming up with. But as always, I'm super happy to be challenged on that topic, and really excited to see what the other engineers bring with their solutions.
I look forward to the day you introduce barge boards into cycling.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like just to come into that, sorry, just a really last minute topic. People ask a lot, well, why don't we put deflectors and little wings and things like this to move the flow around on a bike, like you do in Formula One. Now in Formula One, you're doing 300 kilometers an hour, or 250 average or whatever. You've got a lot more energy available to push the flow around and a lot more power. You've got nowadays, up to 750 to 1,000 horsepower available. In cycling, we're talking about watts. We're not talking, hundreds of kilowatts. We're talking about watts. And you're in a very low speed environment where efficiency is king. And, as soon as you want to deflect any volume of flow, you do a lot of work to the flow. And doing work to the flow means you do a lot of drag. You create a lot of drag. Same thing with lots of topics about vortex generators, and we generate vortices. Vortices are horrible things. Vortices are great for pushing the flow around, but to push the flow around, you need a lot of energy, which means at the speeds of cycling, you need these massive devices, not these little simple tubercles, these little bumps that we're seeing now. And secondly, when you generate a vortex, it creates a lot of drag. So if the vortex doesn't do something useful, all you're doing is creating drag. So it's great, to sort of have ideas and say, oh, what can we bring from motorsport, for example? And even aircraft have sort of surface treatment, riblets, things now to keep flow attachments. But those industries, those mobiles, or whatever you want to call them, they have a lot more energy available to move the flow around. In cycling, we're in ultra low speeds with regards to aerodynamics. And it's a whole different flow regime. It's really costly as soon as you want to start pushing flow around. So you've got to be really careful with those sorts of things. So really interesting stuff, but skeptical as to...
You mean it's not just as simple as putting trip strips everywhere?
No. Trip strips are great on legs and, in these bluff bodies.
Yeah.
So, if you've got, when bluff bodies, you've got these, these legs that are cylindrical, kind of in sort of general shape, our arms and stuff like this. Here, aerodynamics of a cylinder is really, really important because cylinders are super nasty and there's a lot to be gained there. But then when we look at bike frame profiles where you can already produce a really nice profile, or a bike rim where you can produce a really nice rim, you don't need to mess it up. But, we can't shape our arms into aero profiles or our legs.
I've been wondering if you target a specific muscle group, if you could, but
if you could, or put your legs in some sort of glass vases as a child. I wouldn't advocate that, but I mean, good on the body. Not so interesting on bike frames, in my opinion.
Well, Ronan, we're only halfway through, but we already learned a lot. What's coming up in the next episode with JP?
I mean, it's sort of like JP reckons about aero development. We're not even halfway through. There's still more to come. And as interesting as that conversation was, I think the second half of this conversation is going to be as useful or even more than this conversation was interesting. We delve into breaking down some of the aero myths. We talk some aero hacks that you can do at home for free, sort of best bang for your buck in terms of what's going to make you faster on your bike at home. Thanks
for listening, everybody, today, and make sure you tune in next week to get all the rest of this chat.